My parents said, "You're not invited," at my sister's wedding. 3 days later, they begged me to pay $48,000. I never imagined those words would come from the two people who had spent my entire life telling me that family always comes first. It was supposed to be the happiest morning of my little sister's wedding. The venue was glowing with white flowers, crystal chandeliers shimmered above the ballroom, and expensive cars kept pulling into the driveway as guests dressed in designer suits and elegant gowns stepped onto the red carpet. I had arrived early, wearing the navy blue dress my sister had personally helped me choose only weeks before. I even carried a small gift I had spent months preparing for her. Then my mother gently touched my arm and whispered that my father needed to speak with me outside. I followed them, confused but smiling, thinking they wanted help with some last-minute wedding problem. Instead, my father folded his arms, refused to meet my eyes, and quietly said, "You're not invited anymore." At first I laughed because I thought it had to be some terrible joke. It wasn't. My mother took a deep breath before saying they had made a difficult decision. The groom's family was incredibly wealthy, influential, and obsessed with appearances. They wanted everything to look perfect, and they believed my presence would raise uncomfortable questions about the family's past. According to them, I simply didn't fit the polished image they were trying so desperately to present. They insisted it wasn't personal. They claimed they were only trying to avoid unnecessary drama on such an important day. But every word felt like another door slamming shut in my face. Before I could even process what was happening, one of the wedding coordinators politely asked me to leave the bridal suite. A few relatives watched from the hallway. Others stopped talking the moment they saw me carrying my purse toward the exit. The whispers followed me with every step. No one asked if I was okay. No one stood beside me. My own parents watched silently as I walked away from my sister's wedding, humiliated in front of people who had known me my entire life. As I reached my car, I wiped away a single tear and drove off believing that losing my invitation was the worst thing my parents could ever do to me. I had no idea that just 3 days later, those same parents would be standing at my front door, desperately begging me to save them from a $48,000 disaster. 3 days after I was told I wasn't welcome at my own sister's wedding, I had almost convinced myself to stop thinking about it. I threw myself back into work, answered emails, attended meetings, and tried to ignore the painful memories that kept replaying in my mind. Every time I remembered my father's cold expression or my mother's quiet apology, my chest tightened, but I refused to let their decision destroy everything I had worked so hard to build. Then, just after lunch on Monday, my phone started vibrating nonstop. First it was my aunt, then my cousin, then an uncle I hadn't spoken to in nearly 4 years. I ignored every call. Minutes later, my younger sister texted me only 3 words: "Please answer me." Before I could decide whether to respond, another message appeared from an unfamiliar number. It was the wedding planner. At first, I assumed she had contacted me by mistake, but as I read her message, I realized something had gone terribly wrong. She explained that during the final financial review after the wedding, a massive payment had never been completed. Nearly $48,000 remained outstanding between the luxury venue, premium catering company, floral designers, live entertainment, photography team, and several high-end vendors. Because the contracts had guaranteed full payment, every company had now begun demanding immediate settlement. Some were already threatening legal action, while others warned they would pursue collections and additional penalties if the balance wasn't cleared within days. What had looked like a flawless wedding from the outside was quietly becoming a financial nightmare behind closed doors. Panic spread through both families almost overnight. The groom's parents were furious, accusing my parents of hiding serious financial problems. Relatives who had spent the reception boasting about the extravagant celebration suddenly stopped answering one another's calls. Everyone began looking for someone to blame. My father had exhausted his savings to create the perfect image. My mother had borrowed money from relatives without telling anyone. My sister and her new husband were already overwhelmed with debts from their honeymoon plans. Then someone finally spoke the truth that nobody wanted to admit. There was only one person in the family who could write a check for $48,000 without risking bankruptcy. The same daughter they had quietly removed from the guest list because she supposedly didn't fit their perfect image. The daughter they had humiliated in front of relatives. The daughter they believed was an embarrassment only 3 days earlier had suddenly become their only hope. And for the first time in years, my parents weren't calling because they loved me. They were calling because they needed me. When my phone finally stopped ringing, I sat in silence, staring out the window, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Their desperate calls pulled me back to memories I had spent years trying to leave behind. The truth was, what happened at the wedding didn't begin 3 days earlier. It had started long before either of us wore formal dresses or dreamed about successful careers. It began in our childhood, where I slowly learned that I would always be the wrong daughter. I was the oldest, the one who followed the rules without being asked. I finished my homework before playing, helped clean the house every weekend, and looked after my younger sister whenever my parents were busy. If something broke, I fixed it. If bills needed organizing, I helped my father sort through them. If my mother was exhausted after work, I cooked dinner without complaining. I believed that if I worked hard enough, one day they would look at me with the same pride they showed my sister. But that day never came. My younger sister had a bright, outgoing personality that everyone adored. She loved expensive clothes, social events, and making friends wherever she went. My parents loved showing her off. They praised her beauty, celebrated every small achievement, and proudly introduced her to neighbors and relatives. When I earned excellent grades, they simply nodded and said they expected nothing less. When she earned average marks, they threw a family dinner to celebrate her effort. It wasn't that they didn't love me. It was that their love always seemed to come with conditions. They admired whatever made the family look successful in other people's eyes. As we grew older, that difference became impossible to ignore. I worked part-time jobs through college, paid many of my own expenses, and even helped with household bills after graduation. More than once, I quietly covered overdue utility payments without telling anyone because I didn't want my parents to struggle. Meanwhile, my sister was encouraged to enjoy life, travel with friends, and focus on finding the right husband. Every sacrifice I made happened behind the scenes, unnoticed and uncelebrated. Every time I achieved something meaningful, my parents found a way to compare it with someone else's status or reputation. Looking back now, I realized the wedding wasn't the first time they had chosen appearances over me. It was simply the first time they had been willing to say it out loud. They didn't reject me because I had failed them. They rejected me because, in their eyes, I never fit the polished picture they wanted the world to see. And somehow, after everything I had done for them, loyalty still mattered less than appearances. The day I left my parents' house, I carried 2 suitcases, a second-hand laptop, and just enough money to cover a month's rent in a tiny apartment. No one offered to help me move. My father simply said I was old enough to figure life out on my own, and my mother hugged me without saying much, as though she already knew she wasn't going to stop him. I waited for one of them to call and ask if I had settled in safely, but that call never came. From that moment on, I understood that if I wanted a better life, I would have to build it with my own hands. The first few years were anything but easy. I worked long hours, took freelance projects at night, and often survived on instant noodles just to save enough money to invest in my future. There were months when I barely slept because I was balancing clients during the day and learning new skills after midnight. Every setback became another lesson. Every rejection pushed me to work harder. Slowly, the small side business I had started from my kitchen table began attracting bigger clients. One recommendation led to another, and before I realized it, I had hired my first employee. Then another. Within a few years, the company that everyone once dismissed had become a thriving business. Ironically, the more successful I became, the less interested my parents seemed in what I had accomplished. They never asked how my company was growing or how many people I employed. Whenever relatives congratulated me, my parents quickly changed the subject to my sister's glamorous lifestyle or the successful family she was marrying into. To them, owning a business wasn't impressive because it didn't come with a famous last name or old money. They respected titles, luxury, and social connections far more than determination and sacrifice. I stopped trying to earn their approval because I realized it would never come. Instead, I focused on building a life I could be proud of, surrounding myself with people who valued honesty over appearances. My success wasn't handed to me through family connections or financial support. It came from years of discipline, resilience, and believing in myself when no one else did. The greatest irony of all was that the business my parents barely acknowledged had quietly made me the most financially stable person in the family. They just didn't know it yet, and soon they would discover exactly how valuable the daughter they had underestimated had become. For days after the wedding, I kept replaying my parents' explanation in my mind. They had insisted they were only trying to avoid drama. But the more I thought about it, the less their excuse made sense. I had never argued with the groom's family. I had never caused a scene at any family gathering. I had spent months helping my sister prepare for her wedding, and until that morning, no one had suggested I wasn't welcome. Their explanation felt rehearsed, as if they had agreed on it long before they called me outside. Then, almost by accident, the truth found me. One evening, my cousin called to check on me. She hesitated several times before asking if I already knew what had really happened. When I told her I didn't, she admitted she had overheard a conversation the night before the wedding. My parents had been speaking with the groom's mother and one of his wealthy aunts. They weren't discussing seating arrangements or decorations. They were discussing me. My cousin later forwarded screenshots of messages that had been circulating among a few close relatives. Reading them made my stomach turn. My mother had written that she was worried my presence would invite questions about the difficult years when I had struggled financially while building my business. My father had replied that the groom's family valued success that looked effortless and came from respected circles. They didn't want anyone mentioning that I had once rented a tiny apartment, worked multiple jobs, or spent years fighting to build a company from nothing. What hurt the most wasn't that I had been poor for a while. I had never been ashamed of those years. They taught me resilience, discipline, and gratitude. The real betrayal was discovering that my parents were ashamed of them. There was another message that hurt even more. Someone had suggested I could simply wear expensive designer clothes, borrow luxury jewelry, and tell people I had always lived comfortably. My father answered with one sentence that I will never forget. She won't pretend to be someone she's not. He was right. I never would have lied about my past just to impress strangers. I had always believed that honesty was worth more than appearances. But instead of respecting that, my parents decided it was easier to erase me from the wedding altogether. They didn't exclude me because I would embarrass them with my behavior. They excluded me because I refused to hide the truth about where I came from. In that moment, I finally understood something that had taken me years to see. They weren't protecting the wedding from embarrassment. They were protecting an image, and they were willing to sacrifice their own daughter to preserve it. The moment the truth came out, everything changed. The silence that had followed my rejection disappeared overnight. My phone, which had gone completely quiet after the wedding, suddenly wouldn't stop ringing. The first call came from my mother just before sunrise. I watched her name flash across the screen until it went to voicemail. A few minutes later, my father called. Then my aunt. Then 2 cousins. By lunchtime, I had more missed calls than I had received from my entire family in the previous 6 months. It was almost funny how quickly I had become important again. I listened to the voicemails one by one. My mother's voice was shaky as she begged me to call her back, saying there had been a terrible misunderstanding and that the family desperately needed to talk. My father sounded nothing like the man who had coldly told me I wasn't welcome at the wedding. His voice was tense, almost pleading. He said the situation was becoming serious and that I shouldn't ignore my own family during a time of crisis. Hearing him use the word family made me pause. Just 3 days earlier, I apparently wasn't family enough to attend my sister's wedding. The messages kept coming. Some relatives tried guilt. Others tried sympathy. One uncle reminded me that family should forgive each other no matter what. An aunt insisted my parents had only made one mistake and that I shouldn't let pride destroy relationships forever. Another cousin claimed my sister had been crying non-stop since learning about the unpaid balance, hoping that would soften my heart. None of them mentioned the humiliation I had endured. None of them apologized for standing silently while I was escorted out. Their concern wasn't about my pain. It was about their problem. Finally, my father sent a message that explained everything. The venue had officially demanded immediate payment. Several vendors were preparing legal claims, and word had already begun spreading through the groom's influential family. If the debt wasn't settled quickly, lawsuits, public embarrassment, and damaged reputations would follow. Years of carefully protecting the family's image were collapsing in front of everyone. Then came the sentence that made me set my phone down and laugh quietly to myself. You're the only one who can save us. For years, my achievements had been ignored because they didn't fit their definition of success. Now the business they barely acknowledged had become their last hope. Suddenly, I wasn't the embarrassing daughter anymore. I was the successful one, the dependable one, the daughter they needed. But as I looked at the dozens of missed calls covering my screen, I realized they weren't reaching out because they finally valued me. They were reaching out because, for the first time in their lives, they needed something only I could give. I didn't return their calls immediately. Instead, I sent my father a short message that read, "I'll meet you tomorrow afternoon." Nothing more. Within seconds, my mother replied with a dozen thankful messages, assuming I had already agreed to solve their financial disaster. They couldn't have been more mistaken. I wasn't meeting them to discuss money. I was meeting them because I had spent too many years swallowing my feelings, accepting excuses, and pretending their choices didn't hurt. This time, I wanted the truth spoken aloud. That evening, I sat alone at my dining table with my laptop open and a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside me. I searched through old emails, text conversations, and family group chats. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for clarity. Every message reminded me of moments I had ignored or explained away. There were conversations about the wedding schedule that suddenly stopped including me. Seating charts where my name quietly disappeared. An invitation that had been updated without my knowledge. Piece by piece, the pattern became impossible to deny. I opened my voicemail and saved the recordings from the past few days. The contrast was striking. One recording captured my father's calm voice telling me not to attend because my presence might complicate the wedding. Another, recorded only days later, begged me to save the family before everything they had worked for collapsed. Hearing those two messages back-to-back revealed more than any argument ever could. I also found photos from the morning of the wedding. In one picture, I was smiling outside the venue, completely unaware that I was about to be asked to leave. Looking at that image, I barely recognized the hopeful woman standing there. She still believed her family would choose her over appearances. When everything was organized, I placed printed copies of the messages and invitations into a simple folder. I wasn't planning to wave them around dramatically. They were there to remind me of the facts in case emotions tried to rewrite the past. Too often, difficult conversations become filled with denial, excuses, and selective memories. I wanted none of that. As I closed the folder, I made one promise to myself. I would stay calm no matter what was said. Anger would only distract from what truly mattered. I didn't need them to admire my success anymore. I didn't even need them to ask for forgiveness. What I needed was honesty. Before a single word about $48,000 left anyone's mouth, I wanted my parents to look me in the eye and admit exactly why they decided their oldest daughter didn't belong at her own sister's wedding. Only after hearing that truth would I decide what happened next. The next afternoon, I walked into the private meeting room my parents had chosen. My mother stood the moment she saw me, while my father remained seated, his expression weighed down by exhaustion. My sister and a few close relatives were already there, along with the wedding planner who had been trying to resolve the unpaid balance. The tension was obvious before anyone spoke. My father cleared his throat and immediately began explaining the financial crisis, but I gently raised my hand. "Before we talk about a single dollar," I said calmly, "we're going to talk about the wedding." The room fell quiet. My father tried to change the subject, insisting there wasn't time to revisit the past. I shook my head. There will be no discussion about money until I hear the truth. My mother whispered that everyone had made mistakes. I looked at her and replied, "Then say what the mistake was." No one answered. I opened the folder I had brought with me and quietly placed the updated invitation, the messages, and the voicemail transcripts on the table. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked one question. Why wasn't I invited to my own sister's wedding? My father stared at the papers without speaking. My sister lowered her eyes. The relatives who had spent days urging me to help suddenly had nothing to say. Seconds felt like minutes. Then my mother began to cry softly. I remained still. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She smiled. Not because I enjoyed seeing them uncomfortable, but because, for the first time, they couldn't hide behind excuses. Finally, my father let out a long breath. His shoulders dropped as if he had been carrying the weight of the lie for days. "We thought your past would make us look bad," he admitted quietly. "We were afraid the groom's family would judge us. We cared more about protecting our reputation than protecting you." Hearing those words hurt, but they also brought an unexpected sense of peace. I had spent years wondering if I had done something wrong. Now I finally knew the truth. No one argued. No one interrupted. The room went completely silent. In that silence, every carefully maintained image my parents had built began to crumble. They hadn't lost their dignity because of an unpaid bill. They had lost it the moment they chose appearances over their own daughter, And at last, everyone in that room knew it. When the silence finally broke, my father looked at me with tired eyes and asked the question everyone in the room had been waiting to hear. "So, will you help us?" I didn't answer right away. I closed the folder, folded my hands on the table, and looked around the room. Every face was fixed on me. Just a few days earlier, these same people had watched me walk out of the wedding without saying a word. Now they were waiting for me to rescue them. "I have one condition," I said quietly. Hope immediately returned to my mother's face. "You will apologize." She nodded quickly, but I stopped her. "Not here. Not just to me." Confusion spread across the room. "I want the apology in front of the same relatives who watched me leave that wedding. The same people who heard I wasn't invited and never questioned it. I was humiliated in public. If you want forgiveness, your apology should be just as public." My father lowered his head. For a long moment, he didn't speak. I could see the pride he had protected for years fighting against the truth he had already admitted. Finally, he looked up. "You're right," he said quietly. "We didn't protect our daughter. We protected our image." My mother wiped away her tears before speaking. "We failed you. We convinced ourselves that impressing strangers mattered more than standing beside our own child. There isn't any excuse for what we did." My sister stepped forward next. "I should have stopped it," she whispered. "Instead, I stayed silent because I didn't want to ruin my wedding day. I'm sorry." For the first time in years, no one defended their actions. No one searched for another excuse. They accepted responsibility without asking me to forget the pain they had caused. Only then did I make my decision. "I'll pay the outstanding balance," I said. "Not because you expect me to. Not because we're family. I'm doing it because I refuse to let your mistake become a burden for innocent people who simply did their jobs." Then I stood up and picked up my folder. "But understand this. Money can settle debts. It cannot buy back respect. That has to be earned." No one argued. They had believed they held all the power when they decided I wasn't worthy of attending the wedding. They thought they were destroying me, but she had already won. The moment I stopped seeking their approval, they lost the only control they had ever held over me. Life didn't return to normal after that meeting, but perhaps that was the point. Some things aren't meant to go back to the way they were. My parents paid a far greater price than the $48,000 they almost lost. They were forced to confront the truth that years of chasing status and protecting appearances had cost them the trust of their own daughter. For the first time, they understood that respect isn't something you demand from your children. It's something you earn through your actions. My sister changed as well. A few weeks later, she visited me alone. There were no excuses and no expectations. She admitted that growing up, she had always assumed our parents treated us differently because I was stronger and didn't need as much attention. Only after the wedding did she realize that what I had carried for years wasn't strength alone. It was loneliness. She apologized for benefiting from the favoritism without ever questioning it. That conversation didn't erase the past, but it gave us a chance to build a new relationship based on honesty instead of silence. Word about what had happened eventually reached the groom's family. To my surprise, they weren't impressed by expensive decorations or luxury receptions anymore. They were disappointed that my parents had hidden the truth and sacrificed their own daughter to maintain a perfect image. In the end, the reputation my parents had worked so hard to protect was damaged not by me, but by the choices they had made themselves. As for me, I walked away with something far more valuable than money. I finally stopped measuring my worth by whether my parents approved of me. Their acceptance was no longer the prize I had been chasing all my life. I had built my career through hard work, surrounded myself with people who respected me, and discovered that true family is defined by love, loyalty, and honesty, not by appearances or social status. Looking back, I don't regret standing my ground. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let people continue treating you as though your dignity has a price. Self-respect is priceless, and once you learn that lesson, no amount of money can ever replace it. Now I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you had been in my position, would you have helped your parents after everything they had done, or would you have walked away? Share your answer in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that family should always choose people over appearances.